everyone, I'm jumping in here live to make a quick introduction that is a little bit more up to date. We recorded this episode back in January, February time, so we might look a little bit different, and I want to make sure that you know that this guest on today's episode is also one of our speakers at the upcoming webinar and live panel discussion on Wednesday, the 24th of June. I'm talking about Donald Hooton, and he is one of the great guys behind the Taylor Hooton Foundation, and everything that they focus on is about educating youth athletes and teenagers about performance enhancing drugs, and then also helping them understand that there are some safe and very, very efficacious things out there that can give you a small edge if you want to really perform to the best of your capacity. In this conversation, we're going to be talking about creatine, energy drinks, steroids, Mike Israetel, influencers on TikTok, and how all of that is impacting the decisions that our young athletes are making today. If you want to register for the webinar, you can. If you're listening to this episode anytime before Wednesday, June 24th, you can still register. And Donald will be joined with 3 other speakers, and we're going to go into this topic in more detail, covering the science, all of the research, how it fits into a nutrition program for a youth athlete, and also helping you understand how to choose a good quality creatine based on certifications and regulatory things like that. Without further ado, please enjoy this episode with Donald. It was an absolute pleasure to talk to him and get to capture this on the Seizing the Years show for everybody. If you have any questions, you can reach out to him directly, and I'll put all of his contact information and how to reach out to the Taylor Hooton Foundation in the description below, and I hope you enjoy.
Was really glad that Jim from NSF connected us, because this is such an important topic, and especially when it revolves around the topic of creatine, we get a lot of questions about that. But everybody can think to a point in their life when an adult or some sort of influencer suggested to you or recommended to you that you change your physical appearance. So when we talk about athletes, most athletes have been told to get bigger, stronger, or faster, right? And for those of us that have no desire to compete, maybe our parents said, hey, you should lose some weight, or hey, you need to eat some more food and gain some weight. Whatever the case might be, you might not remember exactly what that person told you, but I can promise you that you'll never forget the way they made you feel. And that's sort of where Taylor's story began, but sadly, his life comes to an end. So my younger brother, Taylor, was a high school student athlete, loved playing sports. Baseball has always run in our family. And at the end of Taylor's junior year of high school, he's 16 years old. He's looking at going in to be a senior in high school, and he's wanting to go on and play collegiate sports. Well, it was suggested to him that if he wanted to make the varsity team and he wanted to be the starting player on varsity, that he needed to get bigger, stronger, and faster in order to do so. So, like many of our teens today, they, look around to their friends, and we live in an ultra high-tech world today where you can access tons of information instantly, whether that information's good or that information's bad. But half of the kids on Taylor's team at that time were using anabolic steroids in order to achieve these goals of changing their physical appearance. So Taylor begins buying anabolic steroids when he's 16 years old. And again, this is obviously misuse. These drugs were not prescribed to him. They were purchased, through a dealer at the gym that he was working out at. And Taylor begins injecting himself with anabolic steroids. So quickly, he's seeing some of the, quote unquote positive effects, right? He's adding weight to his frame. He had put on about 30 pounds of muscle. The drugs were allowing him to train 2 times a day, which, from his friends, his coaches, even my parents are like, wow, this is great. Taylor's taken a big interest in his health, right? I mean, he's looking good. He's developing all these muscles. Nobody's ever questioning, could there be some drug use going on here? So Taylor begins experiencing some of the very textbook side effects that many of us have read about, we might have learned about in school, things like androgen-induced acne. This is where acne grows severely across the chest, the back, sometimes down the back of the arms. Taylor had very erratic behavior. Taylor at the time he was a good student. He had almost straight A's. The kid's getting ready to look at where he was going to go to college. He was always a funny kid, so we always called him the family clown. But, friends would tell us like he was a really funny guy. He was a great listener, and he was also really popular. Like, I'll never forget, over 3,500 kids attended his funeral. So one night, somebody's talking to his girlfriend. He gets super angry. He pulls this kid out of car and he breaks the kid's jaw by hitting him. And so at this point, it's like, okay, what's going on here? I mean, we've got this erratic behavior. We have this severe acne. At one point, Taylor got so upset with my parents because they asked him to do chores. He punched a hole in his wall in his bedroom. And, which some people think might be typical teen behavior, but these mood swings were much, much larger than either my sister and I had, or even that my parents were used to with my brother. So Taylor began seeing multiple physicians, and one of the physicians he had confided to that he was using anabolic steroids. And this is what he found to have changed his behavior. They had recommended to Taylor to just quit cold turkey. So essentially, if you just stop using these drugs, all of these side effects will go away. And hindsight's always 2020, right? So looking back, Taylor stops using the drugs. He takes the advice of this physician, stops using the drugs. His body is now no longer producing enough natural testosterone because he has suppressed, right, his natural testosterone production by using these exogenous drugs. And so he's now suffering from what most people know as low T, or low testosterone, which can lead to depression, thoughts of suicide. Now, sadly, Taylor's depression was serious enough that he wound up making even a worse decision because he couldn't see the light at the end of the tunnel, and Taylor took his life. And that's how we founded the Taylor Hooton Foundation in his memory, to really our goal is to educate young people and their adult influencers really about the misuse of these drugs, and really how can they do things the right way, because here in the US this is just not a topic that's being covered very in depth in our schools, and that's something we're trying to change.
It's the second time you're sharing that story with me directly, and it is just as profound and impactful as it was the first time that I heard it. And I found it really enlightening to understand how much pressure there is on young boys regarding their physique and the way that they look, because I've sort of grown up as a young woman. We lived in the USA at the time as well. I grew up in the Midwest. And of course, as a young woman, you're seeing a lot of, it was magazines back in the day and Cosmo and things like that. It was all pre-internet. And for your brother, it was pre-internet as well, which is mind blowing because now teenagers have access to TikTok and Instagram on a daily basis. And it it's enlightening to me to understand that young boys are also feeling pressure to change the way that they look. As you said, I'm appreciative for you sharing it with me and everybody listening today. And it's really profound the way that your family has been able to turn this tragic personal loss around into a service that's just reaching so many teenagers across the US.
Oftentimes, like when we think about eating disorder, or disorders, or body image issues, most people think females, and it's not just females. Where guys also struggle with that as well. I mean, especially when we live in a world today where, I mean, it's most teens that are uploading photos, right? There's filters even on your phone now, right? I mean, there's all these different filters to make us have a perceived image online. And us as consumers, as we're looking at this stuff, it's like, well, I've got to have this ripped body, or this tan, or this certain physique in order for me to fit into society, to be wanted and to feel loved and accepted amongst my peer group, which that's just not reality. So I'm really glad you tied those two together, because it is important. It's not just females, it's all of us as humans.
Yeah, definitely. I would say that there's a bit of space to create some more awareness around that. And I know that you're doing a really good job with it. So now our show is called Seizing the Years, which is typically all about health span and, living life as well as you can for as long as possible. But your story here that you're anchoring this in is quite unique. And so I'm curious to understand what the term longevity means to you, and has it become more about quality of life and something in like the amount of years that we have? And it's a unique perspective. I've never really asked anybody that's sort of had such a close loss how it's impacted their own relationship with the idea of living well for a long period of time. So can you share a bit more about that with me?
Sure. I do think it's about longevity. When you lose somebody close to you. So Taylor and I, we were about 5 years apart, but we were very close. At the time I was in college, he was in high school, so we're both young men at this point. So we have a lot of information to share and communicate about. But when it comes to losing somebody like that and not understanding at the time as to why, I've never dealt with depression, right? I didn't understand what that was. And I had no idea, how dangerous these drugs were because at the time I'm playing college sports and I knew a lot of my teammates were actively using these drugs. And when we formed this organization, we just realized there was just this large information vacuum as to, people were just missing this topic. I mean, sure, we talk about acne or testicular atrophy or maybe even things like roid rage. Great. I mean, but nobody's talking about damage to the cardiovascular system. What can it do long term if you're abusing these drugs? And when it comes to longevity, especially on a topic like this, we have seen this topic just evolutionize over the years. So you go back to the early 2000s when this took place, right? So most people just wanted to talk about PEDs that fell under the category of anabolic steroids, right? Like various types of androgens and testosterones and what have you. And then you start fast forwarding, then it becomes dietary supplements, right? And again, prefacing, not all dietary supplements are dangerous. There is a lack of regulation within that industry that can cause some of these things to be potentially harmful. But we start getting into that. And then, I mean, you fast forward just over the past 6 years. Now you can't even get on social media without hearing about peptides, hormone replacement therapy, testosterone replacement therapy, selective androgen receptor modulators, SARMs. All of these different things are being really rammed down our throat, right? Or through our eyeballs, should I say, and through our earballs, if you will. Nobody has ever really had education on it. It's all really interesting stuff. Testosterone and replacement therapy, these can be very, very good therapeutical drugs, but everybody's mind goes back to if you're using testosterone, you must be on steroids, right? You're cheating or you're using them to get bigger, where we need to bring the whole discussion all the way back to the beginning, right? Again, thinking longevity here, just as times change, as technology changes, how do we adjust our messaging and our education so everybody understands what's going on? Where do they go to get resources? How do they get information? And it's great to have a platform like yours, Rachel, where people can come and learn about this stuff.
It's remarkable how the sort of landscape, even in 2026, with all of the clinical data that we have, there's more than 680 studies that prove that creatine specifically is safe, generally for all ages, for healthy people. But it still occupies this sort of bizarre gray space for the general public. And I would say since last summer, there's been some improvement there, thanks to really mainstream publications covering creatine, if not having it like on the top of their website for a couple of days. Like Vogue and Vanity Fair and Times all covered creatine last year in a really positive way that felt very fresh and updated.
And I don't mean to laugh. It's just funny because this is a question we get all the time from young people. Is creatine safe? Isn't it like steroids? And I'm like, your parents must have grown up in like the 80s or 90s, right? Well, how did you know? Well, because I mean, I even remember, in the 90s when you had people taking creatine, it was like, oh, well, you must be a bodybuilder, right? So which that was kind of the stigma at the time. And I'll never forget asking you and your dad that question when we had our first call. And it's really stuck with me because I never understood how that stigma. I mean, we're talking about a controlled substance here, and then we're talking about creatine, two totally different things, right? It's like vitamins or heroin. Okay. It's like I don't see the connection here, but it's interesting because young people ask us that all the time. Is creatine safe? How much creatine should I use? Is it going to shut my body's creatine production off? All these great questions. And what it stems back to, we believe, and why I always ask the kids, like when your parents grew up, because during those times when I grew up, that's what we heard. I mean, if you were reading bodybuilding magazines, right? Or you're watching strongman competitions, whatever the case might be, creatine sort of got looped into that bodybuilding culture. Where today, I mean, we know, like I take creatine every day. We know it's good for your brain, it's good for muscle recovery. There's so many great benefits to it that I think along the lines of like the same education we're trying to do that encompasses everything of what we call appearance and performance enhancing substance. A lot of this stuff has just been demonized so long. It's just been ingrained into our minds that, yeah, this stuff is dangerous. when in reality, it just comes back to these discussions that we're having, Rachel. It's education. It's getting an understanding. Okay, what is a dietary supplement? What is creatine? What is it made from? And you've already got it in your body. So I guess we're all bodybuilders, right? If you want to sort of take that analogy, but it just goes back to just education. And sadly, your whole discussion of, I go from, looking at creatine videos on TikTok, and the next thing you know, somebody's injecting themselves with a peptide or Lord knows what. I mean, even the algorithms are confused here. Now, I mean, I guess I could see how the algorithms are looking at something that, can enhance muscle or enhance recovery. And I guess you loosely tying that to a drug that's controlled, or some of them aren't even approved for use in humans yet. But to kind of wrap everything up, I just think it's just lack of awareness, lack of education.
And it's like a specific type of persona. And it's kind of right now, it's this combination between, for some reason, white Monster energy drinks, specifically that white one,
I don't know.
creatine, and then some form of syringe-based injectable enhancer. And then I'm like looking for the caption and I'm hoping it's going to be like this long with really educational content. And it's often just like a one-liner of somebody saying like, pounded it today, like, and I'm like, this is really also desensitizing people to the idea of actually, being in the bathroom and injecting yourself with something, which brings me to my next question,
Right.
because I would say we're kind of living in a time right now where needles are big, like in between Botox, lip injections, GLP-1, also in the fertility space, just IVF treatments, and then people with diabetes. People are becoming quite comfortable with the idea of injecting yourself, I feel like, which I've never had to do, but it used to be like a very alien thing. I mean, if I was a teenager and I found a needle in somebody's bedroom, I would have been like very, very concerned. But
Mhm.
especially online, whether it's beauty or conception or, fitness, it's becoming just visually a little bit more normal to see that. Do you think there's a bit of a psychological jump to anabolic steroids that maybe then feels a little bit less scary or a little bit less risky?
Sure. I like the word you use, like desensitized, because I mean, you think about just the state of the world, right? And I mean now, I mean, you see various things that happen online that you would only see in like a Hollywood movie, right? But now it's real, and everybody's, whether it's violence or we talk about needles and that sort of thing. I think that conclusion's pretty easy to draw, right? So there are cultures like in Latin America where they are more needle first, right? So why we take our vitamins, through a pill, there are some vitamins like in the Latin American culture that are delivered through a needle. So it's not a big deal, as big a deal to them. But you're right. I don't like needles. I'm always scared. I give blood and do all that fun stuff, but I don't like having to take an injection. But when you start thinking about things like Botox, lip injections, GLP-1s, right? Even now, as more males are getting on TRT as they get older, right? So these are going to be things that we see around the home, okay? And then we start seeing this stuff online. So to me as well, and I don't want to speak for the young people, but I could easily see how you can make an easy jump. Well, hey, I'm taking, the white monster and creatine, and all of a sudden, might as well get on testosterone too, because it's almost like every other ad that you see on TV is a GLP-1. It's get on this testosterone. How do we use these various drugs, which most of them are injectable? Obviously there are some creams and pills that you can take on the testosterone side, but or pellets, where I mean, it's almost becoming common nature. Like again, going back to the same word used, it's desensitizing. So it's like it can't possibly be that big of a deal. I see, mom getting her Botox, dad's taking his TRT. Like, oh well, I end up buying some illegal drug online and I'm injecting. It's got to be the same stuff that they're taking, and that's definitely not the case.
You work really closely with actual students, and most of the time when I check your Instagram stories, you're literally like outside a school or flying to a school or in an assembly hall or in a gym, facilitating these amazing assemblies that your organization travel around and do in real, like in person, which is just amazing. Not remote, not digital, not like webinar. You're actually getting in front of these kids and speaking to them face to face, and I don't know, maybe answering questions personally afterwards as well. And so I'm curious to understand, when you're kind of talking to people that are on the fence, like maybe have already entered the world of PEDs or like are curious about it, what do you recognize or what have you learned that is the key motivator that, these youth athletes are actually trying to achieve?
I would say social media. I mean, if you think, obviously the time when your dad grew up or even when you and I grew up, I mean, the social media wasn't a major part of our life where today it's completely ingrained in us, right? Where those social pressures to look good and feel good about myself are there, not just on a daily basis, but almost on like an hourly basis, depending on how many times we pick up the phone or, or we even turn any sort of media on. And that's, what's being burned into these young kids' heads that, if you want to fit into society, you have to have this perfect body. If you're a little bit overweight, we have a drug for that. And it goes back to that initial question that we kind of discussed in the beginning of this recording was, have you ever thought when you're looking in the mirror, right? Like, I'm not exactly happy with what's staring back at me. Or has that adult in your life that's a big influence on you suggested to you, and again, not maliciously, but to change your physical appearance? And we can think as parents, we can think maybe as brothers, sisters, or cousins, or aunts, or uncles, hey, maybe you shouldn't eat that, or so and so they're getting a little chubby, where we think, okay, that's harmless because our brains have developed and we understand, we're not trying to be malicious or mean. But what that's telling that young person is, well, I'm fat. I've been taught to look at the number on the scale versus how, am I really healthy? And what's happening is, they're taking that information from inside the home, the way that they feel, because it's like, well, I'm overweight. I really need to lose some weight, or I need to put on some muscle, right? So I can fit in. Now here come all these influencers, right? I'm trying, this new peptide, which by the way, some of these things that these influencers are pushing haven't even been approved by the FDA here in the US. Some of them haven't even been approved for use in humans. I mean, you even have some of these social media influencers that have named themselves after illegal drugs. And they openly talk about this drug use on YouTube, where if you and I were sitting here talking about, say, something like suicide, I mean, they wouldn't even allow it to be aired on YouTube, right? It would have to be bleeped or what have you. So it's just part of our culture today, and which is why it's so important, especially with our young people. When we're going into schools or we're doing podcasts or things like this, it's important that we're talking to people about it and making sure that at least adults are aware as to what's going on out there and what sort of content their young people are consuming.
I'm just going to double down on a topic that's off
Yeah.
script. You should be able to answer it without having prepared anything. But I know on the Houghton Foundation landing page, you call out energy drinks immediately in your top sort of description. And it keeps coming up in my questions and little anecdotes as well. And so when did that happen? Obviously, like Red Bull was the first big energy drink, and then that just exploded. And so when did you guys realize, and when were you able to validate energy drinks need to be addressed as part of this problem?
Well, that's a great question, because when we kind of go back to the whole thing you talked about, longevity and how things change, and how, especially as educators, we need to continue to adjust and pay attention to sort of the culture and what young people are doing. And when it comes to energy drinks, you're right. I think Red Bull was like one of the first out there. And if you look at the ingredients of a Red Bull compared to what is available today. Now you go back to the original Red Bull. I mean, it was minimal caffeine, some other sorts of stimulants. They were typically sold in the smaller cans. So, some of these brands have come around to the 16-ounce, even the 24-ounce energy drink. And even over just the past, let's call it less than 10 years. I mean, you have seen marketing develop, right? Where you, here in the US, okay, and it might be different over there in Europe. I would assume it's the same, because this is a multi-billion dollar industry worldwide. When you walk into a gas station, or I mean, really any store today, you're hard pressed to find walking to a register without passing an energy drink. Where if you think back, let's go back to 10 years ago. I mean, typically, I mean, you're going to, they started out in like the supplement aisle at the grocery store. Then they, made it part of like the beverage aisle. And now really, I mean, they own a lot of the end caps. The marketing's phenomenal, to the point that I remember I was doing a program here in Dallas, Texas, where I am, and I was going to go grab a coffee before a program. So I saw one of these energy drinks was brightly colored and had some little candies on the front of it. And I said, oh, I'll use that as my prop. So I had it up on the podium as we were talking and what have you. And I remember bringing it home. And the next morning, my 3-year-old at the time, our little boy, was like, oh, Dada, can I have this before school? And I'm just like, but together, my wife and I were just looking at each other because they're like, they were my son and my daughter, who was 2 at the time. They were just sitting there looking at it, just enamored with it. But what's happened is, and most people want to pay attention to just the caffeine content, right? So the American Medical Association recommends for somebody under the age of 18 no more than 100 milligrams of caffeine. Now, the majority of these drinks are going to have somewhere around 200 milligrams of caffeine per serving, which is why it's important, to, depending on the size of the can that you're purchasing, to see how many servings are in there. But also, I mean, nobody's talking about things like taurine, right, which is amplifying the effects of the caffeine. Again, just take taurine by itself. Or you have things like guarana, right, which is going to cause you to feel more alert, as well as give you more energy. So we're no longer talking just caffeine, right? Like a coffee. We're talking multiple ingredients that target the cardiovascular system. And then, and I'm going to wrap this up. I don't want to over talk this thing, but the problem today is with the marketing, with the internet. You can buy this stuff in bulk for pretty cheap. I can't tell you, Rachel, how many students, and this is anecdotal, this is just talking with the students one-on-one. But if I asked a group of 100 students to raise their hand, if they knew somebody that consumed 3 to even 5 energy drinks a day, I would bet over a 25%, 25% of those hands would go up, that they know somebody, right? And they start laughing about it. But I had a girl just here in the beginning of the year that came up that says, I drank 5 energy drinks every day. Now we have a problem, right? It's not just having one every now and then, it's drinking 5 a day.
At Generize, we like to make a division between kind of stimulant-based energy support and then where creatine fits, which is into this foundational and also like bio, down to the molecules of our body and its natural systems on stimulant-based support. So when you kind of look at everything that we are using to kind of get ourselves through the day at the moment, from sugar to caffeine and then other kind of more supplements that give you like a bit of a buzz, maybe like a cognizin or some of the other nootropics, for example, you do feel the effects of those within like 20 to 30 minutes. It might be soft and gentle. Of course, matcha and all of these things, alternatives. Coffee's been a bit demonized in the last years, I think, but there's a lot of stimulants out there. And what we try very hard to explain is that creatine is not fitting into that like immediate stimulation type thing. It's also one of the reasons why it can be difficult for people to understand if the creatine that they're supplementing with is actually having an effect or not, because we're kind of wired to have this like 30 minutes later, I felt buzzed feeling, and creatine's not going to give you that. And so educating around those 2 different types of energy is really, really important. And, there's pretty much no reason why a teenager should be, ruining their natural energy production systems by creating this hyperdependency on really stimulating caffeine, sugar, et cetera, based products. Because at that age, your creatine production, if you're healthy, is absolutely like spot on. Your natural bodily system at that age is like prime, like well through your 20s. And so we're seeing a lot of interesting things at the same time. There's such an increase in like chronic fatigue and like everybody's like more tired than ever before. And it's like, this makes no sense because we're also consuming more stimulating, products on a daily basis and kind of creating this catch-22.
We've had multiple young kids say, they get their creatine source through their pre-workout. So if I'm going to take I'm going to take a pre-workout to get myself, amped up before I go to the gym. Well, in that scoop, I also have 5 grams of creatines, I guess. Probably not, but like if you want creatine, take it separately. But that's sort of their mindset is, I'm getting all the vitamins and everything that they do. Just like you're saying, we're putting in all sorts of ready to drink products and protein powder, whatever the case might be. It's like, okay, well now all of a sudden I'm already getting the creatine I need.
Yeah. Yeah, it's sort of a battle between convenience and clarity. Convenience is king. That's quite clear, especially when you're talking about energy drinks, just like really being pushed at you when you're leaving this, trying to get out of the store with a broccoli or something like that, and it's like, hey, buy a Monster. But there is a specific sort of influencer or internet persona that I would absolutely love to touch on. And that is a guy called Mike Israetel. I believe he's actually a doctor. I think he has like a doctorate and PhD, which is fantastic. And he's incredibly open to his followers about his use of performance enhancing drugs. And he openly shares about it because he wants his audience, with good intentions, to understand that the way that he looks is not natural. The way that his body is, the proportions of it, the sizing of it for his physique, it's not normal, put that in quotation marks. And he doesn't want anybody to get a false sense of promise, because you're never going to look like that from taking just supplementing creatine and bench pressing. So on the one hand, he's transparent. Honesty is the best policy. I love that. I have respect for it. From your perspective as an absolute, expert and somebody with such a personal story really close to your heart on this topic, do you think this level of honesty is actually helping to harm like reduction, or is it inadvertently framing a dangerous trade-off as like a worthy price to pay for a certain aesthetic? Would love to hear your take on that.
Again, I don't want to talk out both sides of my mouth. So I know who Mike Israetel is. I've tuned into his channel. He's got a lot of really good information on these drugs. He breaks this stuff down. So I think from the aspect of being open and talking about it, and yes, I did achieve this physique by using drugs. And you're right, like, no food on the planet or supplement on the planet is going to cause you to have massive muscle growth and burn body fat quite like these drugs. Again, they work. I think for so many years, people have just, like, oh, I earned this body on my own, right? They saw, they saw it as cheating. Like, even if you had this muscular physique, perfect example, Liver King, right? For many years, he denied the use of performance enhancing drugs, where it's clear that, I remember having students, I said, do you really, when this whole thing started, do you really think that guy's on gear? Do you think he's on steroids? And it's like, find me a 50-year-old man that's not on TRT, that is using no drugs, that has a physique like that. It's just, it's impossible. So from the one aspect, I think it's great that he's open about it. He does talk about the detrimental effects that can take place, the warnings, especially as it results to the cardiovascular system, that these drugs can shorten your life. They can cause roid rage. They can cause depression. That's wonderful for an adult to hear. The problem is, and again, this isn't Mike's problem. This is a social media control problem. But you go on YouTube or Instagram and you're listening to these videos. Well, so is a 14-year-old kid. Now, if we go back to our teen years, okay, we think about, nobody's worried about 10 years from now. Oh, you might not be able to have kids. Who cares? I'm not thinking about a family right now. Or, this could cause you to have not heart disease or heart issues later in life, or it could lead to heart disease. I don't care. I'll deal with that in 10 or 15 years. It's like smoking or drinking. We educate on this sort of stuff, but you think about us as teens, we didn't care, right? Like, you're not of that mindset. Your brain hasn't developed yet. So I think, again, I don't want to talk about both sides of my mouth, because I think the information he's sharing is great. I think from an adult standpoint, that might deter some usage, but also it allows somebody to make an educated decision, if you will. But the young people, they're not hearing all that. What they're seeing is it causes massive muscle growth. Look at my physique. The only way to obtain this physique is to use these drugs. That's what they're hearing. And the sad part is, for somebody like Mike, that's a doctor, he's got legal access to TRT as a male. Here in the US, once you hit 40 years old, it's not very, even in your 30s, it's not very difficult to go get a prescription for TRT, where they're getting legitimate drugs, where a doctor's monitoring it. Tell that to the 14-year-old kid. One, they don't have access to a physician that's going to prescribe it to them. Nobody's helping them guide this stuff. So they're going out on things like Reddit, out into the dark web or various sites where you have people telling them how much to inject, what sort of drugs to use, what this drug regimen should look like. And these kids are experimenting on themselves, which at that age, we have no data that shows that this stuff is safe and the long-term effects that it can happen of our young people. So that's kind of both sides of it. I think the information and content he has is great. The problem is it's not restricted. And you have young people seeing it that are disregarding the side effect piece, and they're buying stuff on the black market. So it makes it extremely dangerous for our young people.
Yeah, sense of discernment at that age is just so limited. And then you're thinking short term, right?
Mhm.
Especially if you're at a college for 4 years, you're like, I need to perform my absolute best between now and being a senior. And that's the goal. And that's how far I can see. And so then the consequences don't feel like it's ever going to happen to you, right? It's classic. What is your advice in terms of approaching the conversation, and how can we talk about the risks of PEDs without being condescending or sounding like some sort of rigid lecturer or like, I know better because I'm older than you? How
Mhm.
can we share the science and kind of really keep that empathy piece intact so that we don't just sort of come over all high and mighty and, that pushes teenagers away as well, right? If dad's just got a heavy hand on the topic and
Yep.
shuts it down, then it doesn't maintain an open channel to foster communication in the future. So, what's your big tip for starting to talk about it and then keeping it on the table as a discussion point in a family?
Beautifully said. You got to put yourself back to when you were a teen. The second you tell a kid, don't do that, right? Okay, I know better than you, dad. And after having kids, I'll never forget. I've told my dad 100 times, like, I wish I didn't think you were as stupid as you were when I was growing up, and I would have listened. But my dad's point is you've got to fail, right? You have to fail. You have to learn. That's how we get better. But I think my advice is just what you said, Rachel. It's we have to be open about this stuff. These drugs are out there. These drugs are available. They're openly being discussed. So if you're allowing them to be on social media, you need to allow yourself to at least have the conversation. So as an adult, I would highly recommend just do basic education on this. We actually have a whole page dedicated to parents on our website where you can go and there's questions. We've already teed up the questions that you can ask your young people. And what I always find interesting is when we tell parents, coaches, athletic trainers, nurses, some of these questions, it's like, wow, the kids are really excited to talk about it. It's like, sure they are. Because one, it's not discussed in schools. The last thing we want to do, let's not demonize these drugs. Okay. Like obviously there are some detrimental side effects to them, but need to understand from their point of view is why are they asking about it? Right? Put yourself back as a teen. Are they wanting to change their physique? Is there something you were suggesting to them? Again, let's not just put it all on the kid. Are you suggesting to the kid, oh, you need to get bigger, you better eat more? Or the big thing is, whether it's male or female, you need to lose weight. You're getting a little chubby. Maybe you shouldn't eat that. Now, while your brain has processed that stuff over the years, think about what that's telling a young person today, which is why I think a lot of doctors are getting questions from parents for their teens, like, when can we get a kid on a GLP-1, on a weight loss drug, versus talking about, why don't we sit down together and learn about nutrition, learn about calories in, calories out? How do I get you, young person, the person I love that's in my home? How do I get you those help and those answers? And there are people it's free. All this information's free. You can get all of this. But again, just getting an understanding from the young person why they're asking the questions. And my last example I want to leave, Rachel, is when we started getting questions on the topic of trenbolone, right? Very, very dangerous drug, not approved for use in humans. It's been used in the bodybuilding world for many, many years. It's like the monster of all anabolic steroids. But when you start getting questions from eighth graders, ninth graders, 10th graders, and they're saying things like, is trenbolone safe? Well, at first I was like, certainly, I kind of dismissed it. Like, why? Definitely not talking about the same topic here, until I came to realize, like, when I got the question again, which was like 2 days later from a totally different school, totally different student. Hey, is trenbolone safe? I said, can I ask you a question? Whatever, first of all, do you know what trenbolone is? Well, no, I don't. But why are you asking that question? And then boom, they pull up their phone and showed me all these different influencers they were following that they were talking about it. But none of the influencers are talking about, hey, these are illegal. Hey, these have some very detrimental side effects. Sure, they work and they work very well for muscle growth, right? But there's all these things that go along. They're illegal, all this stuff. I think we just need to be more in tune with why our kids are asking the questions and just try to equip yourself as best you can to answer those questions for them.
Yeah, it's being prepared and probably letting them know that you're there for them and it's not taboo to talk about it. Amazing stuff. Where can people find you? I follow you on Instagram. Are there any other sort of digital places, lettery, anything you want to send people to before we finish for today?
Yeah, certainly. So we've got a website, taylorhooton.org. It's full of information, whether it's for parents or young people. We do have a newsletter we send out monthly. We're like everybody else on all major social media platforms, including TikTok, is where we're trying to obviously reach young people. So, young people out there, please come follow us there. It's very difficult to get followers, especially with this topic out there where you're trying to talk about the right things. But and we have a podcast as well that we use as a resource, much like yours. We want to discuss all of these topics with experts to give their side of the story, to give their information and the data that they have so that people can learn more and educate themselves.
Fantastic. Well, I know I've learned an awful lot from this conversation today. And if you are curious to hear more specifically about creatine, a little bit more of a creatine heavy conversation, then my dad and I will be on Donald's podcast as well later in the next couple of months. So if that link is live, and when it is live, I will add it to the description for this video and on Spotify as well. So thank you so much for spending
Thank
your
you.
time with us today. It's been an absolute pleasure. See you next time.
Yeah, thank you.
Great.